Hi guys, this is a really kind of a fun lecture. Today we're talking about why we all look so good these days. Seriously, we're talking about whether or not there are any universals as far as what people find attractive. Now, people have been talking about this for years. They've talked about whether or not, the Rubenesque women or these different eras throughout. Of course, we have the the ancient Greek idea of beauty with the 7 to 1 heads and all that. And fundamentally, there are a few universals, but the universals aren't not what people think they are. We'll talk a little bit later on about secondary sexual characteristics, which is a pretty interesting aspect of some of these things. And we'll certainly assess those. But for the most part, and there are a lot of secondary sexual characteristics, but they have a different reason behind them. Um, as far as attractiveness, doesn't always seem all that heavily supported by secondary sexual characteristics and those sorts of things. So really, we're going to narrow down what exactly it is that people find attractive and why. And a little, well, throughout this, as usual, we'll try to break down some of the presuppositions that a lot of people have and some of the ideas that you may think that are attractive or that the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever finds attractive. And you may be right, you may be wrong. And we'll talk a lot about those things. One of the first things that are usually bandied about when people are talking about structurally what humans find attractive in a universal way is something called facial symmetry. That is, the left and right sides of their face, indeed their whole body, look relatively symmetrical. But with all of these things that I'm going to bring up, for the most part, there is a certain amount of not too much and not too little. It's got to be just right, that kind of Goldilocks idea, where if it looks too symmetrical, it's off putting. If it looks a little asymmetrical, that's great. But if it looks really asymmetrical, that is also very off putting. So let's look at these three pictures below here. The first one, which is over to your left, is this woman's natural photograph. It's her with all of her asymmetries and everything else. She looks fairly attractive. The center picture is her left side mirrored, and it looks a little weird. The furthest to the right is her right side mirrored, looks a little strange. It's too symmetrical. It's almost robotic. In fact, we actually appreciate these idiosyncrasies, these natural look, is really what makes us individualized. It also is what people find comfortably attractive. So it can't be too symmetrical or it looks uncomfortable. It makes the viewer uncomfortable. So what are all of these things really surrounding? All of the following universals that we're going to talk about are all based on health and how healthy an individual appears. There are a lot of aspects to health that are going to come through with this, but symmetry is the first of those aspects. If they have a growth or something kind of like one side of their head is way bigger than the other or something else is off, we really don't like it. Skin health is the second major one. Skin uh, kind of maladies can be taken in a lot of different ways. Again, we can overlook a lot of things. For example, the one on the far left, that is often too much skin disfigurement or unhealth for us. We don't really like that. If it's way more than anything we have experienced, or if it's somewhere near something that we experienced when we were really unhealthy, we never associate bad skin with good health. It's always clear skin is tantamount to good health, and that is really important amongst people these days. This comes from the fact that we're really a pack animal. We're an animal that is used to being in close quarters with others, and as such, getting up and close and personal with somebody with possibly a communicable disease often which is shown by lesions on the skin, like herpes or to a greater degree syphilis and things like that, where these problems really are off-putting to us because they don't look healthy. However, the photograph in the middle, that's generally acceptable by most people. Would say, you know what? I've had a zit or two. Zits, little things like that, little idiosyncrasies don't bother us that much, especially if we're attracted otherwise to the individual. We can overlook a temporary, or what we assume is a temporary issue. And of course, over to the far right is perfect skin health, in which case we would usually be fine with that. Interestingly, skin health and some of the other things, I mentioned how we actually prefer it somewhere in the middle in the asymmetry symmetry scale. In skin health, we generally would veer toward, hey, the smoother, cleaner, healthier the skin, the better, no matter what. So even a little bit of zits or things like that are generally seen as, oh, something I've got to cover up. But it's usually not a deal breaker for people as far as attractiveness goes. However, if it goes all the way over to the other side of the spectrum, where we're seeing a massive skin lesion or something else that seems unhealthy. Interestingly, scars don't necessarily follow this. A scar is something that is not, we don't associate with a disease. Therefore, scars are usually seen as, okay, I can overlook that fairly easily. That falls back into this health idea. Again, scarring depends. If you have massive scarring or something else like that, oftentimes that can be a deal breaker. But a scar here and there generally doesn't bother either sex. There are a lot of preconceived notions as to these things pertaining to one sex or the other. And we'll address that later on. It's kind of interesting. Okay. The next major one with skin is skin tone. We really like these medium skin tones. It's interesting, but around the world, regardless of what the normal skin tone in a given area is, either very, very pale or very, very dark skin, around the world, everybody seems to agree that the medium skin tones are really attractive. And that falls into something that we're going to bring up in the next slide, but it's a very important thing. We've talked about it in the past, we'll talk about it in the future, but the key here is we're looking at health. And why does a medium skin tone denote health? Considering that some groups from around the world have very, very dark skin as the norm within that environment, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. Conversely, other areas like in the northern areas, like Northern Europe, tend to have very, very light skin, very pale skin. Yet, those two skin types are very well adapted for their areas, as we've mentioned before. But both of those groups agree that a medium skin tone tends to be more attractive. Interesting question. Why would that be? If you want to ponder that, you can, but I would suggest hitting pause at the end of this slide before we get to the next slide. Hit pause now if you want to ponder it. If you don't, I'm going to move on. Why is that medium skin tone so important? The bottom line is racial admixture. That is mixed individuals. These are people who have a diverse genetic background. Why is that so attractive? For the same reason as everything else, it has to do with health. Admixture, meaning the more biological diversity you have in the background of your family tree, denotes how healthy you are. Let me kind of illustrate this by giving you the opposite. The opposite of racial admixture, inbreeding. We all know automatically, we think about inbreeding, you think about, oh my God, that is not healthy. You think of diseases and maladies that are associated with a given family. Truth is, Inbreeding does not create the malady. For example, if a brother and a sister had a baby, their babies are not necessarily going to have mental retardation or anything like that. They're going to have a higher chance of having mental retardation or some of the other things, like some of the famous things that happen amongst the European nobility because of inbreeding. For example, a very enlarged facial feature, like the enlarged chins of the Spanish dynasty, or the mental instability of the Georgian dynasties, specifically um, in the Habsburgs and mostly the Habsburgs and the English throne. We also have groups that have things like porphyria is very common. Other skin abnormalities like profuse hair growth that we saw in Emperor Maximilian and some others. We see this in let's see, we see it in Tsar Nicholas II's son, who had what is it? Hemophilia, which means that if he were to start to bleed, he wouldn't stop bleeding for a very long time and may actually bleed out. He may actually die, which led to all kinds of other things, including probably ultimately the revolution, which is very interesting, how and why that happened. So there's all sorts of issues like that which are associated with inbreeding. The opposite is true with racial admixture. The more admixture a human has, the more the lower likelihood of them having one of those maladies that tend to turn up. They're usually, if we can go back to our Punnett squares and stuff, they're usually a recessive genetic trait, which would lead to things like porphyria, hemophilia, those sorts of things. There can also be other issues, like physical issues, which may stem from another sort of abnormality that is within that family. For example, inability to walk properly, or a club foot, or things like this. There's all sorts of them. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands of them. So racial admixture is the key to good health. And furthermore, if you look at famous people, like I have a slew of them here, you look at famous people who have racial admixture, they're inherently very attractive. And pretty much everybody agrees on that. But women look for caregivers, right? Isn't that true? Isn't that this idea that we're forced into thinking, oh, men are looking for, men are shallow. They're looking for just the looks and the way the body is and all these other things. But women are looking for something more. They're looking for somebody who is intellectually stimulating and can be a caregiver in future. Is that the truth? Absolutely not. Women gauge attractiveness via health standards just like men do. We look at, by the way, do you guys remember this guy? This is the, what would they call him? The mugshot hottie. He was actually on the news. They were talking about this guy for a long time. This is a mugshot. He is clearly not a caregiver. He is a guy going to jail, God knows for what, but he's still very attractive. And women were talking about it. He was on the news because he was so attractive. He looks like a model. Women gauge attractiveness via health standards just like men do. In fact, these are seen as universals. Look at this guy. He's got the medium toned skin. He is African descent with blue eyes. That is admixture right there, and he looks really attractive. He's got amazing facial and probably body symmetry. He's a very good looking guy. But these are the universals. Obviously, individual tastes vary. But how much do they vary? Truth is, not much. The variation of kind of individual taste, these were talked about for years. They talk about, eras in which, one group is really attractive during the Renaissance, or during the early Victorian era, or all these things, and what men and women find attractive, and yada yada. Truth is, all of those things do not deviate very far from these universals. This is just a smattering of the universals. There are a lot more. But fundamentally, every single universal, meaning it can be found literally worldwide, what we find attractive as human beings always has something to do with our outward appearance that reflects our healthiness and our ability to retain that health and, of course, pass that health on to our offspring. 100% of these universals are based on health and the ability for that individual to pass those health kind of traits onto their offspring.